Good day, everyone. You're tuning in to Voice of the Voiceless. I'm Dan Kovalik, and I'm thrilled to have a new guest today, Luisa Martinez. She is the co-chair of the Portland chapter of Democratic Socialist of America. She's on the steering committee of DSA's International Committee. She is a full-time union organizer who has organized 6 strikes in the last 3 years, and she's a committed international socialist. Luisa, welcome.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Luisa is also the best tour bus companion anyone can have. We toured around Venezuela together, and it was a great time.
Thank you. I don't know why I didn't include that in my bio.
It's a great part of the bio. It's the icing on the cake. So, okay. So I guess that's the segue into saying that we're going to talk about Venezuela today. And from the perspective of someone who is in Democratic Socialist of America, maybe we should start and tell people about Democratic Socialist of America, Luisa. Can you tell us a few things about it?
Yeah. So I learned about DSA on my trip because it was part of a delegation of 8 folks. And so we constantly had to repeat just kind of a short summary of DSA. So DSA has 94,000 members, which is considerable for the left in the United States. I know we have 4 people in Congress that we've endorsed and that are members. And, we have a national organization that's extremely active. I'm, like you mentioned, part of the International Committee, but then we also have local chapters in many cities as well. So that works on, things like ordinances and local electoral campaigns, mutual aid, immigrants' rights organizing, police abolition work. And so it's pretty broad, the spectrum of issues that DSA focuses on.
And what exactly, if you had to define it, what is a democratic socialist?
It is somebody who is fed up with the 2-party system that we currently have in the United States. And it is somebody who has some awareness of the situation that we're in, not just nationally, but globally, especially when it comes to climate catastrophe. And somebody who's just who has that level of awareness and is fighting for a better future. But that's also very broad, right? So we consider ourselves a big tent organization, and so a variety of tendencies are represented within that.
Yes, and I'm a bit familiar with that. I was a member of DSA during college. I was a member of the Dayton chapter, University of Dayton chapter of DSA. And I just rejoined, as you know. And so you had a small contingent of DSA members who went down to Venezuela. Can you tell us how that came to be and why you went?
Yeah. So it's not the first time a DSA member has gone to Venezuela. I know somebody who's part of our national political committee went 2 or 3 years ago for the Mayday Brigade, I believe it was, but it was one person. And then, so because of that, the organization had ties to Venezuela, and so we were invited to send a group of people to El Congreso Bicentenario de los Pueblos del Mundo, the Bicentennial Congress of the People of the World. And so, just like I think it was like 120 different parties were represented at that Congress. So DSA was just one of them, but we were invited.
And how many of you came down from DSA?
8 people in total.
And was that, without controversy within DSA?
Honestly, I think anything related to Venezuela, there's some controversy. But what I've found is that when it comes to Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, really any state pursuing a socialist project, the people who are the loudest voices against never seem to leave, for better or for worse. But for the most part, I will say with this particular delegation, we had a tremendous amount of support when we came back. And we did a report back for our members, which was very well attended. And it was overwhelming, the love that we got. So I can say that, a small fraction of members who might be upset when we take these types of steps might be upset, but it's a very small minority.
And so can I ask you for your general impressions of your trip to Venezuela?
Absolutely. Yeah. Off the bat, it was clear they took coronavirus very seriously. Everybody was wearing a mask. We were tested. We were tested before we left. We tested right when we got there. We were tested many times. And most of the places that we went into, just like shopping centers, we had our temperature taken, and then we were giving the hand sanitizer. I know we stayed at a hotel. We were coated with some sort of something before we went to the hotel, presumably disinfectant. We were sprayed with like a spray gun, and so it was a country taking it very, very seriously, especially considering the sanctions that have been put on the illegal sanctions that have been put on the state of Venezuela that has caused an inability for them to get vaccines. So that was right off the bat an impression that I got right away. And actually, I had a number of Venezuelans approach me on the topic and just like couldn't believe 600,000 people dead in the United States. I had like at least 4 people tell me that because they couldn't believe 600,000 people dead in the United States. So that was, like I said, that was a really obvious first impression. But more broadly, there was an awareness, again, of the situation that they've been put in, but also a strong sense of pride in the community that they've been able to build despite that. So, I knew about the blockade, but I was able, and I helped start a group called Hands Off Venezuela Portland. So I was well aware of the sanctions, but the impact of illegal sanctions, but being able to see the effects on daily living and then having a new understanding of the psychological impacts of that was something that was new for me. And I'm somebody who's already sympathetic and knowledgeable. So that was another thing, particularly medical supplies, the impact that they've had. People have really minor ailments that turn into chronic ailments as a result of just not being able to get even normal, like over-the-counter stuff. The impact that it's had on women's ability to, for family planning, it's made, legal sanctions have made contraceptives, a price that is prohibitive for most working class Venezuelan women. It's like $10 for contraceptives, which doesn't sound like a lot of money for us in the United States, but that could be like your monthly wage as a Venezuelan worker. So that was another thing that was very clear. But despite that, and I want to make this clear because I never want to paint Venezuelans as just being victims of U.S. empire or anything like that. That despite all those things, there was a very, very strong sense of hope that they had some semblance of control. Despite the illegal sanctions, that the things that they were able to control were positive steps towards something better. And that was also an important thing for me to see as a socialist in the United States.
And what were some of those things giving them hope? What are some of the things that they have been able to control and that they are controlling?
Well, elections. So that was, I know in the United States we hear that's like, whatever, they're just elections, but there's a significant difference in the level of participation, again, towards building this thing that's better before and after the revolution that does resonate with people who can at least remember that time. So that's one thing that was clear. I have to think about the answer a little bit more.
That's okay. Well, one that occurs to me, something we did together. We went to one of the communes and a place where they're building their own housing units with some help from the government, resources from the government, some land from the government, but they're doing it themselves. And that was pretty amazing to see.
Yeah, one of the more interesting things that I heard from one of the communards that spoke to us was that they're really trying to redefine the concept of work, right? And get it out of the way that we see it in the United States, which is just the amount of time that you spend before you can do the thing that you want, to really understanding one's own labor as a contribution to society as well, right? And just rethinking work. I mean, in those communes that we went to, I think they worked 4 hours a week, literally building the commune, like in George's book. And that meant many things. Sometimes it meant with raw materials when they were able to get them. But it also meant helping in a variety of ways. But really, again, really trying to redefine how Venezuelans understand work was really interesting to hear.
And you were able to get out a little on your own at the end of the delegation to talk to people on your own. Did you have any interesting conversations with Venezuelans?
Absolutely, yeah. So I will say, to focus on this too much, but one of the broader criticisms was that, this was a state-sanctioned tour and that we weren't able to talk to people and everything was sanitized. It wasn't a literal sense. Like I said, they took coronavirus very seriously. But I will say, as somebody who chose to stay extra, I was totally on my own. They said, call us if you need anything, but for the most part, enjoy yourself. And so I just walked around Caracas a lot. I talked to people. I talked to a woman. Very interesting conversation. She was, we were talking about the varying levels of consciousness within Venezuela and how it impacts politics and how it impacts how things are dealt with internally. And so she mentioned to me, her father was a very famous Chavista activist. And so as a result of that, she was kidnapped. And she was kidnapped when she was in her teens. And after that happened, she said, after those 3 hours were over, I immediately called my father and I said, I don't know what the hell's going on. You need to solve it. And whatever it is, don't tell me. And as a father, his response to her was, okay, take my car keys and go disappear for a week. That's a remarkable story, in my opinion. And the reason why she conveyed it to me was to actually humanize not the far right opposition of Venezuela, right? I mean, they meet the definition of fascist, but the soft right, if you will, understanding why experiences like that and the threat of violence can impact people's political consciousness, why their commitment to the Venezuelan Socialist project might waver. And she said that, her parents were very, very good at explaining things to her, right? Explaining the politics in the country, even as a teen. But she could understand why anybody might give pause for thought if they were kidnapped as a kid. And there's all kinds of stories like that too. I know that being a Chavista on the Colombian border is very risky and very brave thing to do. So, for instance, I heard another story from somebody else that I talked to, dropping off a clap box, right, which is part of a government program to provide subsidized food and materials to Venezuelan working class Venezuelans. Dropping off a clap box is a dangerous thing. Like you don't just do that on the Colombian border. You don't just go off by yourself. Like you have to make sure that you have a ride there. Like it's something that's very carefully planned because you don't know who's watching you and you don't know who's with the opposition and who's not. And that's just the reality of Venezuela, of what the far right is capable of, and then the massive responsibility of the Venezuelan left in maintaining the socialist project.
And on the Colombian border, of course, you also have other actors like the Colombian paramilitaries who are lurking around, causing chaos, violence, and even assassinating some political leaders like Robert Serra. I got to see Robert Serra's house where he was killed. Did you get to his house?
Yes, I did. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he was a congressman who was killed in 2017, I believe, by Colombian paramilitaries, very popular congressman. Of course, there were those, connecting the dots, there were those Colombian, they're calling them mercenaries, but paramilitaries who clearly were involved in the assassination of the Haitian president recently. So this struggle, or the right-wing violence, is being internationalized in a way that we haven't seen probably since Operation Condor in your former neck of the woods, the Southern Cone. You're from Chile, of course. And Operation Condor emanated from Chile initially and was spread throughout the Southern Cone, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. And it was a project to spread fascism, and it succeeded for a time. And we're seeing the Colombian paramilitaries play a surrogate role for the U.S. in doing a similar thing in the Caribbean side of South America and the Caribbean itself. Well, go ahead. Any other conversations that you found interesting, again, on the street especially?
Well, I mean, this wasn't on the street, but I will say there was a really, really interesting moment. So when we did two things in the same day. The first part of the day, we visited Fábrica de Fábricas, factories, which was, I believe, an idea of Chavez, and it was the vision was to produce industry, like to produce large machinery that can then be disseminated to other parts to produce other things. So, for instance, engines, train materials to build train tracks, irrigation pumps, those types of things. Kind of the basic things that are needed to start smaller plants. Anyway, my point is that we got a tour. It was very interesting. And so we walked around the facility. And so, again, because of the combination of illegal sanctions, mostly sanctions, but also COVID, it was a facility that's built for around 7,000 workers. And I think it was like 100 and less than 150 were there. But that was the first part of the day. And so the second part, we met with PDVSA, which is the state-owned oil company. And so we got the impression, it's like, okay, we're going to put on a hard hat, go look at some drills or whatever. I don't know how oil works, to be honest with you. But, we just thought it would be kind of an extension of, what we saw earlier that day. And what we actually got was a presentation by 6 or 7 different PDVSA workers of varying status within the company say the same thing. Which was, you will take our oil from our cold, dead hands, which was not the message that anybody was expecting, right? Again, we thought we were just getting a tour of how oil is extracted and refined. But the reason I think why that was communicated was not to us necessarily as individuals, but to convey this message that PDVSA represents the idea that Venezuelan resources are going to go to the Venezuelan people. Because at the end of the day, this is my perspective, that, the attack, the reason why the U.S. imposes so much terrorism on Venezuela is because is ideological, right? The U.S. government, D.C. can't stand the idea of there being another Cuba or there being another Nicaragua, whatever. But it's also material, right? I mean, you've heard U.S. officials state very plainly that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and so that's also very much driving the interest in that particular country. So that was a really again, it was a really interesting conversation that we were able to have with PDVSA workers. And like I said, the message that they ultimately wanted to convey to us
was don't take the oil, right? And of course, we have to point out the U.S., stole Citgo, which was Venezuela's largest single source of revenue. Venezuela's U.S. oil and gasoline company. There's Citgo stations here in Pittsburgh. They're all over the country. The U.S. literally stole that company from Venezuela, depriving it of billions of dollars, and it's now going to sell it off piecemeal. It'll never be returned to Venezuela. This is just theft. And so that idea of the U.S. stealing their oil is not fanciful in any way. And but to hear workers talk in that way is pretty amazing and pretty inspiring.
Yeah, and I will say, I think for those of us who are who have an interest in Latin American politics, understand that the social programs are essentially funded by these oil revenues, right? And so as a result of U.S. theft of resources, right, a classic example, in the global South, they've lost like 99% of their income to be able to fund these programs. And so it's actually really remarkable to me that I think particularly leftists in the United States, they lose that perspective. The hurdle that the Venezuelan Socialist Project has been presented with as a result of these illegal sanctions. 1%, they're running an economy on 1% income. That's magic.
Yeah.
At least in my perspective.
No, and I think that's, where I get frustrated with many on the left in this country is they see the shortcomings of revolutions like that in Venezuela, but don't give them the credit for what they've done, notwithstanding incredible hurdles that have been presented to them by the United States. And a few things we heard while we were there was that, Venezuela is now like 82% food sovereign, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And that's in response to the sanctions. They've had to grow their own food or they would starve. And I just saw this week that the government has built its 3.6 millionth housing unit for the poor in Venezuela, which, again, in spite of the sanctions, is quite amazing. But still, people's lives are difficult there. And I don't know if you have any stories that illustrate that, things that you saw that illustrated those types of difficulties.
Yeah, it's hard to navigate. It's hard to convey because it's so clear that that day-to-day Venezuelan life is structured around this illegal blockade, just like in Cuba, right? But despite that, like I said, there's a strong sense of hope, and it's evident in talking to people and having conversations with communards, with workers, with PDVSA workers, with folks who work in medical clinics, with women who do projects in communities on various forms, educating community members on various forms of violence as a result of government programs that have been implemented. It's hard to balance those two things, and again, it gives us pause for thought. It invites us to take a step back and think about what we can really learn from these countries that are able to navigate all of these hurdles that they've been presented with. That's the thing. I think that's one of the biggest frustrations that I have is this complete lack of humility, right? Again, understanding how to run an economy on 1% income. What would you do if you lost 99% of your income as an individual, right? What kind of gymnastics would you have to do in order to just meet basic needs? And it looks like they're doing it despite the circumstances they've been put in. They're still building. Sometimes there's setbacks, right? Just like Che Guevara writes about in Socialism and Man, right? There's some times where you just kind of you might regress a little bit, but ultimately you have to have a vision for the future. And that's clear, right? That goes to the hope.
I want to ask you, you were able to meet your group, the DSA folks had your own meeting with President Nicolas Maduro, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah. So that was fun. He's a funny guy. He made a couple jokes. And so that was certainly a part of the trip. It was maybe a 45-minute meeting. And he was, he made a point to greet us individually. We were given a book, biography of Simone Bolivar. And, he kind of he expounded a lot on U.S. empire, and particularly all of the, the conversation was centered around that.
And you got some flack for that meeting. In fact, I think you sent me a headline, I think from Breitbart News. There were a couple saying DSA, folks meet with dictator Nicolas Maduro, that sort of thing. What would you, how do you respond to that sort of accusation?
Well, here's the thing about criticism from the right in the United States is that it's all lies. So it's really hard to respond to it. What do you say when somebody says, the sky is purple? Where do you begin with that? And then to what extent is it even important? Elliot Abrams wrote some sort of blog post about our trip too. It's kind of funny. I like the idea of him waking up really angry and having a cup of coffee and just, writing something. But the fact of the matter is, Elliot Abrams isn't going to join DSA. Elliot Abrams is, none of the people who read that are going to join DSA, except, people who are hate reading it, maybe. So it really doesn't, I don't want to be so dismissive, but for me personally, with the organizing that I do, it really doesn't matter. It just helps me bounce out of bed in the morning, to be honest with you.
But I think what you're saying when you give the sky color analogy is that simply our view, your view, and my view, our view, is that he's not a dictator, that he's a democratically elected leader. And for those who say otherwise, it simply is not true, and it's not the reality on the ground there.
Right. And even a survey, a survey view of information about the Venezuelan election process that is outside of U.S. hegemony, right? If you look at international sources, if you read from election observers, it's very clear that he was democratically elected, that Venezuela has an electoral process that's so remarkable. As Jimmy Carter praised it at some point, and so it's going back to the sky is purple. Very clearly, this has been studied. People have, Venezuela is always welcoming election observers, and it's very clearly not the case that he's some sort of brutal dictator.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter called the Venezuelan electoral system one of the best in the world. And I think he said it was the best in the world, actually, and much better than the U.S.'s electoral process, by the way, in the view of former President James Earl Carter. Any other just impressions or thoughts or comments before we end this discussion? If for a listener who doesn't know much about Venezuela, what would you say to that person about why they should support the project that's happening there now?
I think for our organization to send a delegation, it was an important step for us. And again, exercising humility, right, in what other socialist mass organizations are trying to do, right? So we have a lot to learn in the United States, especially considering we've never won, right? I mean, we've had small wins. I'm not trying to I'm not trying to be too dismissive, but Venezuela is a country that has electorally won an important first couple of steps towards it. They're in a socialist transition, right? And so I don't know why we in the United States wouldn't be interested in that, and why we wouldn't think that we have a lot to gain from understanding what they're doing, what they've done, and again, the position, the stumbling blocks that they're laboring under, right? So I welcome learning more and visiting Venezuela again to get, for myself, to have a deeper understanding of what's possible.
Well, I think that's a great message that I wholly support and agree with. And yeah, I would say for people who have any curiosity about Venezuela or countries like Cuba or Nicaragua, they should go to those places and see for themselves what's happening. We get so few reportages from those countries, right? Most of what we hear is hearsay, truthfully, and propaganda. We don't get to hear from the source itself on the ground. And you were able to do that, and that's great. And your group was able to do that. And it was great to have you all on the delegation. It added a lot of life to an otherwise, aging group of people who've been going. So it gave me a lot of hope that you were there. It gives me a lot of hope that you were there. And that's why I wanted to have you on the show. And I hope people see that, see you, hear you, and capture some of that energy, that we both got from being in that country.
Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the show. It was a real pleasure. I hope you will come again. And, I support your effort to defend Venezuela. That's, something that I've been dedicated to. And, again, I just joined DSA in part because of your encouragement. And hopefully we can have some influence in the organization.
Absolutely. Yeah. If anything, I will say DSA, for its kind of mixed perspectives on the global South, DSA is emphatically against sanctions. And that is something that is unquestioned within the organization. And so minimally, as leftists in the United States, that is something that we all can contribute to in terms of fighting against.
Great. That's very important to point out. I'm glad you pointed that out. And let's tell folks, Bernie Sanders is a member of DSA. AOC is a member of DSA. I mean, there's some very prestigious Congress people who are members of DSA and that have some influence. And hopefully they will have some influence to stop these sanctions. That would be an amazing thing. Okay, Luisa, thank you so much. And again, hope to have you on the show again.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Dan.
Absolutely. Take care. Okay, I'm going to take us out then, Luisa. This has been Voice of the Voiceless. I'm Dan Kovalik. You have been listening to Luisa Herrera Martinez, the co-chair of the Oregon chapter of DSA, a member of the steering committee of DSA's International Committee, and a longtime union activist. I hope you enjoyed the show as much as I did. Thank you, and good day.